A bloodstained nurse walked into a Phoenix courtroom wearing a battered military jacket, and the judge ordered security to remove her before she said a single word. She didn't move. "Take it off," the judge said, "or get out." She looked at him with the kind of calm that made people uncomfortable, the kind that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from having survived things most people can't imagine. Then the courtroom doors exploded open. A 4-star general stepped inside and said 3 words that stopped everyone cold. "Nobody touches her." What happened next would expose a conspiracy that had buried an innocent man's life and humiliate every person in that room who thought they already knew who she was. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea what you'd been through, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next one, and hit that like button before this is over. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. People are watching from places that would surprise you. Let's find out where you're from. The drive from Mercy Crest General to the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse took 19 minutes on a normal morning. Abigail Hart made it in 14, and she didn't bother changing out of her scrubs. There hadn't been time. She'd been on her feet since 7 the previous evening, 12 hours that had included 2 cardiac events, 1 crash intubation on a man who'd coded 3 times before they finally stabilized him, and a teenager with a GSW to the shoulder who'd spent most of the night crying for his mother, while Abigail held pressure on the wound and talked to him about anything except what was actually happening. Her shift had ended at 7:15 in the morning. The courthouse opened at 8. She'd pulled her military jacket from the back seat of her car. It had lived there for 3 years, shrugged it on over her scrubs, and driven across town with dried blood still on her hands from the last IV she'd pulled before clocking out. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had, and it hadn't seemed like the kind of thing worth stopping for. Ethan Brooks was going to trial today, and Ethan Brooks had nobody. That was the part people didn't understand about veterans who ended up in the criminal justice system, not the ones with lawyers and advocates and family filling the gallery, but the other ones, the ones who came home quietly and tried to fit back into a world that had moved on without them. Those men didn't announce themselves. They worked night shifts at warehouses and paid their rent on time and didn't ask for anything from anyone. And when something happened, when the world finally came at them sideways, they stood there alone in a courtroom with an overworked public defender and a prosecutor who had already decided what the narrative was. Abigail had met Ethan 8 months ago through a veterans outreach program she volunteered with on her days off. He was 41, quiet, in the way that combat veterans often got quiet. Not cold, just economical. He chose his words carefully. He didn't gesture when he talked. He made eye contact and held it, which some people found unsettling, but Abigail recognized it as a habit of attention. You learn to watch people closely when watching closely was the difference between making it home or not. He told her about the incident the night it happened, calling her from a police station waiting room because she was the only number in his phone he trusted. "I need you to understand something," he'd said, his voice flat and measured in a way that told her he was holding himself together with real effort. "I didn't lose control. I want you to know that before anything else." She'd listened for 40 minutes. By the end of it, she understood exactly what had happened and exactly why it mattered that someone was in that courtroom today who could explain it in terms a jury could follow. What Ethan had done, in the parking structure of a shopping center on a Tuesday evening, was stop a man from beating a woman unconscious. He'd done it with the precise, minimal force of someone who knew how to end a physical confrontation quickly and without killing anybody. And then, when the attacker hit the ground and started making sounds that suggested a possible airway obstruction, Ethan had immediately rolled him, cleared his mouth, and kept him breathing until paramedics arrived. The woman he'd saved had disappeared before police came. The attacker, whose name was Preston Dahl, whose father was Stuart Dahl, who owned 3 commercial real estate firms and sat on the board of 2 hospitals, had told the arriving officers that Ethan had attacked him unprovoked. By the time anyone thought to look for the surveillance footage, the camera covering that section of the structure had been offline. Technically. The maintenance log said it had been offline for 2 weeks. The timestamp on the most recent maintenance request said something different, but that document had been misfiled. Ethan had been charged with aggravated assault. Abigail had spent the better part of 6 months helping his public defender, a 29-year-old named Cora Vasquez, who was handling 14 active cases and running on 4 hours of sleep and gas station coffee, build a case that the system was not particularly interested in helping them build. She'd found the medical records herself. She'd contacted the trauma unit that had received Preston Dahl that night and gotten the attending physician's preliminary notes that described injuries inconsistent with a purely offensive attack, that described a jaw strike and a controlled takedown rather than a beating. She'd found a witness, a parking attendant named Deshawn, who'd been in the booth at the structure's entrance and heard the altercation and stepped outside just in time to see Ethan kneeling over Dahl with 2 fingers in his mouth, not throwing punches. It hadn't been enough. The prosecution had a detective named Falco who was willing to testify about the defendant's military background as a risk factor. They had Preston Dahl, who cleaned up well and spoke in complete sentences and had cried, apparently quite effectively, during his deposition. What they needed was someone who could stand in front of a jury and explain, not argue, explain the difference between controlled force and uncontrolled violence. Someone who had seen both up close in conditions that stripped away all ambiguity. That was why Abigail was here. She found parking 2 blocks from the courthouse and walked fast, the morning already warming toward what would be another brutal Phoenix July. The jacket was too heavy for the heat, and she knew it and didn't care. She'd worn it through worse. The marble steps of the courthouse were crowded with the usual morning population. Attorneys in suits checking their phones, families looking lost, a bail bondsman she recognized from a case 2 years ago. She pushed through the main doors, cleared the metal detector, checked the docket board, and found courtroom 7 on the 3rd floor. Cora Vasquez was waiting in the hallway outside, holding a manila folder and looking like she hadn't slept. She probably hadn't. "You made it," Cora said. "Said I would." Cora looked at the scrubs, the jacket, the state of Abigail's hands, and did the math. "How long was your shift?" "Doesn't matter. Walk me through the morning." Cora did, quickly and efficiently, because whatever else she lacked, the woman knew how to communicate under pressure. The prosecution was leading with Detective Falco, who would establish the timeline and characterize the attack. Then Preston Dahl. Then their expert witness, a forensic psychologist named Dr. Winslow, who specialized in what Cora called, with audible contempt, combat veteran risk profiles. After that, the defense would present. Cora had Deshawn the parking attendant, the trauma unit physician's notes, and Abigail. "What's the judge like?" Abigail asked. Cora's expression told her everything before the words did. "Calloway. He's been on the bench for 22 years. He runs a tight courtroom, very formal." "Does he have a problem with witnesses?" "He has a problem with anything that slows things down or doesn't look the way he thinks it should look." Cora glanced at the jacket. "I have to ask you, the jacket stays on." "Abigail, Cora, the jacket stays on. If that becomes an issue, we'll handle it then." Cora pressed her lips together and nodded. She'd learned in 6 months of working with Abigail Hart that there were certain conversations that were finished when Abigail's voice went quiet and level. This was one of them. They went inside. Courtroom 7 was a mid-sized room with high ceilings and wood paneling that had gone slightly dull with age. The gallery was maybe a third full. Abigail spotted Ethan immediately. He was at the defense table with his back straight and his hands flat on the table in front of him, the way soldiers sat when they were making a conscious effort to appear calm. He turned when she came in, and something in his face loosened slightly, just for a second, before he controlled it again. She found a seat in the gallery and waited. The prosecution's case went the way Cora had predicted. Falco was smooth and practiced. He'd testified dozens of times, and it showed in the way he let silences work for him, the way he said, "the defendant," without any particular emphasis that somehow carried all the emphasis in the world. He laid out the timeline, the injuries, the responding officer's observations. He mentioned Ethan's service record in a way that was technically neutral and functionally damning. Preston Dahl was worse, because Preston Dahl was genuinely good at performing victimhood. He was 44 and handsome in an expensive way, and he sat in the witness box with the careful posture of someone who had been coached, but was pretending he hadn't been. He spoke about being attacked out of nowhere by a man he'd never met. He described the fear. He touched the side of his face, healed now, barely a mark, and let the gesture do its work. Abigail watched the jury. 3 of them were already leaning slightly toward the prosecution's table. Not a lot. Enough. Then Dr. Winslow testified for 40 minutes about hypervigilance and misattributed threat response and combat veterans with inadequate post-service mental health support, all of it framed in the careful language of clinical concern rather than accusation, which made it more damaging than accusation would have been. She watched a 4th juror tip. When the defense began, Deshawn testified first. He was nervous on the stand. Abigail could see his hand shaking slightly when he adjusted the microphone. But he was honest, and honest had a texture that coached didn't, and a few of the jurors leaned back in slightly, which was something. The trauma unit physician's notes were entered into evidence over a mild prosecution objection. Judge Calloway allowed them with a tone that suggested he was doing the defense a favor. Then Cora said, "The defense calls Abigail Hart." Abigail stood from the gallery and moved toward the gate in the railing, and that was when she heard it, the shift in the room. A murmur that passed through the gallery like a small disturbance in water. She registered it without paying it much attention. People reacted to the scrubs, maybe, or the jacket, or the blood still on her hands that she had genuinely forgotten about until this moment. She pushed through the gate and walked toward the witness stand. She was almost there when Judge Richard Calloway looked up from whatever he'd been writing and saw her, and his face did something she recognized immediately. Not surprise, exactly. More like the automatic recalibration that happened when someone encountered something that didn't fit their template and chose offense over curiosity. "Hold on," he said. She stopped. Calloway looked at her over his reading glasses. He was in his late 60s, barrel-chested, with the kind of authority that came from decades of being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He let the silence stretch for a moment, a practiced technique, she understood, one designed to establish who set the pace in this space. "Is this your witness?" he asked Cora. "Yes, Your Honor. Abigail Hart, RN, trauma specialist." "I can see what she is," Calloway said, which was a strange thing to say and landed strangely. "Ms. Hart, you're here to testify in a court of law." "I am," she said. "Then I'd like you to look appropriate for these proceedings." He made a gesture with his pen, indicating the jacket. "Take that off." The room was very quiet. "I'd rather keep it on, Your Honor." Something shifted in Calloway's face. Not anger, not yet. More like the adjustment of a man recalculating how much resistance he was dealing with. "That wasn't a request," he said. "I understand," Abigail said. "I'd still like to keep it on." The jacket was a field jacket from her last deployment, olive drab and worn soft with age. The elbows had been patched twice. The left shoulder still carried a unit patch that was partially obscured by a small tear in the fabric, the kind of damage that happened when you'd been somewhere that things tore. It was not a clean jacket. It was not a presentable jacket by the standards of a formal courtroom. She knew that. She also knew exactly what it was and what it represented and what she had worn it through, and she was not going to take it off because a man with a gavel found it inconvenient. Calloway sat back slightly. "Ms. Hart, this is my courtroom. In my courtroom, witnesses present themselves with appropriate—" "Your Honor," Cora was on her feet. "My client's witness is a decorated veteran and certified trauma specialist who came directly from a 12-hour overnight shift to testify on my client's behalf. She has—" "Counselor, I did not ask for the witness's biography." Calloway's voice had gone cold in the specific way that courtroom authority went cold. Not louder, just denser. "I asked her to remove the jacket." "Your Honor, the defense respectfully—" "I'm not asking the defense. I'm asking the witness." He looked at Abigail again. "Take it off, or I'll have you escorted from this courtroom." Abigail looked at him. She'd been looked at with contempt before. Real contempt, the active kind, deployed by people with actual power in actual dangerous situations. Calloway's contempt was bureaucratic. It was the contempt of a man who had never had to choose between 2 bad options in a moment where the wrong choice got people killed. She didn't hate him for it. She just understood precisely what she was dealing with. She turned and looked at Ethan. He was watching her. His face was composed, but his jaw was tight, the way it got when he was managing something difficult. And she knew he was thinking about telling her to just take the jacket off, that it wasn't worth it, that nothing about him was worth it. She had heard him say things like that before, and she had never once agreed. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I have been in this jacket in places where taking it off wasn't an option. I'll extend you the same courtesy I extended those situations. I'm respectfully declining. The silence was the specific kind of silence that happens when something irrevocable has just been said. Bailiff, Calloway said. The bailiff, a broad man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be somewhere else, stood from his position by the wall and began moving toward her. Cora was speaking, something rapid and urgent about witness rights and procedural overreach, but Calloway had stopped listening to Cora. Abigail could see him processing the decision to make an example, could see him choosing it, and she stood and let him choose it because sometimes the only thing you could do was stand in place and let the situation develop and trust that the truth had enough weight to find the floor eventually. The bailiff was 3 steps from her when the courtroom doors opened. Not loudly. They opened the way doors opened when the person pushing through them was used to doors opening for them, smoothly, with the confidence of someone who had never once wondered whether they'd be allowed in. General Marcus Holloway was 63 years old, 6 feet 2, and wearing his dress uniform with 4 stars on each shoulder and 11 rows of ribbons on his chest. He had the face of a man who had operated in complete certainty for so long that uncertainty had simply stopped trying to approach him. He paused for exactly 1 second in the doorway, reading the room the way military men read rooms: exits, threats, objectives, friendlies. His eyes found Abigail. Stand down, he said, quietly. Not loud. He didn't need loud. The bailiff stopped moving, not because of any formal authority Holloway held in this room. A general had no jurisdiction over a county courthouse. He stopped because of something more basic than jurisdiction. He stopped because of the specific gravity that some people generated, the kind that didn't require an explanation. Calloway leaned forward. This is my courtroom, General, and I don't know what you think Your Honor. Holloway walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of a man who had never hurried for anyone and wasn't planning to start. He stopped at the railing and looked at the judge. I apologize for the interruption. I have information relevant to these proceedings, and I would very much appreciate 30 seconds of your time before you do something I suspect you'll regret. Calloway's face had gone through several phases in the last 10 seconds. Now it had settled somewhere between territorial and uncertain. The gallery is for observers, General. If you have information, I'm aware of proper procedure. Holloway's voice was not unkind. It was simply final, the way the last word of a sentence was final. I'm also aware of who that woman is. He looked at Abigail, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, because Holloway was not a man who showed surprise. Something quieter. I thought you were dead, he said. Abigail looked at him. I thought about it, she said. The room had gone so quiet that the air conditioning was audible. Calloway stared at both of them. I don't know what this is, he said, but it is not how my courtroom— Your Honor. Holloway set his hands on the railing, a deliberate gesture, measured and formal. That woman is a holder of the Distinguished Service Cross. She holds a classified commendation from a special operations unit that no longer officially exists and that I am not at liberty to name in open court. She was designated by that unit as Ghost Medic 7. He paused. If you are considering having her removed from this courtroom, I need you to understand something clearly. I will personally ensure that every oversight body with jurisdiction over this courthouse is aware of that decision before the end of business today. Calloway's face had gone carefully neutral in the way that faces went neutral when someone was deciding how much trouble something was going to be. That's not— he started. I'm not threatening you, Holloway said, still quietly. I'm informing you. There's a difference. Abigail stood in the center of it all and felt the specific exhaustion that came not from lack of sleep, but from the accumulated weight of being in spaces where she constantly had to be more than what people expected, just to be allowed to be anything at all. She was 39 years old. She had been awake for 26 hours. She had dried blood on her hands from a man she'd kept alive through the night. And now she was standing in a courtroom while a general explained her worth to a judge who had decided in 10 seconds that she had none. She did not let any of this show. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the bailiff, who had not moved. "Sit down, Gerald," Calloway said to the bailiff. Then he looked at Abigail. "Take the stand, Ms. Hart," he said. She did. Cora moved to the defense table, gathering herself with the visible effort of someone who had just watched something unexpected happen and was recalibrating fast. The prosecutor, a man named Garrett Voss, who wore expensive suits and had the lean, practiced look of someone who had won a lot of cases by knowing when to push and when to wait, was watching Abigail with a new quality of attention. Not quite concern, more like revised assessment. Holloway took a seat in the gallery, in the front row, directly behind the defense table, which was not subtle and was not meant to be. Abigail settled into the witness chair. The room felt different than it had 60 seconds ago. Not friendlier, something more complicated than friendly, more attentive. She'd had audiences like this before, in other contexts, other rooms, other kinds of testimony. The sensation was familiar and not particularly comforting. Cora approached and began walking her through the foundational questions: name, profession, credentials. Mercy Crest General Medical Center, trauma specialist. 14 years in nursing, the first 6 in the Army. She answered each question in the same even tone, without elaboration, without performance. She was not here to impress anyone. "Ms. Hart, in your professional assessment," Cora began. "Objection." Voss rose. "Before we proceed with this witness's testimony, the prosecution would like to voir dire her qualifications, specifically regarding her claimed specialty in—" "She's a certified trauma specialist, Mr. Voss," Calloway said. There was something slightly different in his voice now. Not warmth, just less cold. "That's in her disclosed credentials. You'll have your cross." Voss sat down slowly, and Abigail watched him calculating. Cora walked her through Ethan's case with methodical precision. Abigail described what she knew about his history. Not the classified parts, the human parts. 11 years of service, 2 deployments. A man who had come home and built a quiet life and worked nights at a logistics company and volunteered 3 Saturdays a month at a veterans support center. A man who in 8 months of regular contact, she had never once seen lose his temper. "In your experience," Cora said, "as someone who has treated combat veterans, what would you expect from a veteran of Mr. Brooks' background when encountering a violent situation?" "Depends on the veteran," Abigail said. "The assumption that combat experience produces uncontrolled aggression is it's a narrative. It's not what the data shows. What it actually produces, in people who come back intact, is the opposite. Highly controlled response. Trained triage. The capacity to assess a threat quickly and use the minimum necessary force. Minimum necessary force. That's the principle. You neutralize the threat. You don't escalate beyond what the situation requires. If the situation changes, if the threat level changes, you respond to the new situation. And if the threat is neutralized, what happens then? You shift to damage control. She said it simply because it was simple. Whatever you just had to do to stop the situation, now you're responsible for the outcome. That's the training. You don't walk away from a person on the ground. Voss was watching her with the expression of someone who had prepared a cross-examination and was now wondering if it was still the right one. "Ms. Hart," Cora said, "were you aware of any physical evidence relevant to this case that may not have been presented to the jury?" Voss stood immediately. "Objection." "I'll allow it," Calloway said. "For now." Abigail looked at Cora, and Cora gave her a very slight nod, and Abigail understood they were approaching the part of this that mattered most. "Yes," Abigail said. The room shifted again, the way rooms shifted when something real was about to happen. "Can you describe that evidence?" "A folding knife," Abigail said. 3.5-inch blade. Recovered from the clothing of the individual Mr. Brooks restrained at the scene by the first responding paramedic. She paused. It was documented in the EMS run report. It was logged by the paramedic as recovered property. It was transferred with the patient to the trauma unit, logged in the patient's property record, and it is not in the prosecution's evidence inventory. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Voss said, "Your Honor." "A moment, Mr. Voss." Calloway was looking at Abigail with an expression she hadn't seen from him yet. Not respect. Not quite. But not contempt either. Something that was working its way toward paying attention. Ms. Hart, are you saying that evidence of a weapon on the alleged victim is absent from this proceeding? I'm saying the documentation exists, Abigail said. I've seen the EMS run report. I've seen the trauma unit's property intake log. The knife is documented in both. I don't know where it is now. Voss turned toward the prosecution table and the two detectives seated behind it, and something happened in the space between them. A look, a half-second of communication that was not as private as they thought. Across the room, Abigail watched Ethan Brooks let out a breath he had been holding for 8 months. She kept her face still and her hands flat on the railing of the witness box and held her eyes on the judge and waited for whatever came next. Because this was not over, it was in fact only the point at which it was beginning, and the men on the prosecution side of the room had just started calculating how much trouble they were actually in. She could see it happening, could see the shift from confidence to something more careful, more watchful. Voss was already on his feet with a prepared objection, voice smooth, the argument ready, the performance of procedural control fully intact. But the paramedics' report was on the record now. The knife existed. And whatever had happened to it between that parking structure and this courtroom, whatever hands had moved it, whatever drawer it had ended up in, whatever conversation had decided it was inconvenient, all of that was going to need an explanation. Right now, in this room, in front of these 12 people and this judge and that general sitting quietly in the front row with his hands folded and his 4 stars catching the courtroom light. Abigail looked at the jury. 7 of them were leaning forward. Detective Falco, in the gallery behind the prosecution table, had gone very still. Falco's stillness lasted exactly 4 seconds before he leaned toward the man beside him and said something low and fast, and whatever it was made the other detective look at the floor. Voss was already moving, stepping toward the bench with the controlled urgency of a man who needed to change the subject before the subject changed him. Your Honor, I have to object to the introduction of this line of testimony on the grounds that the alleged document the witness is referencing has not been authenticated, has not been entered into evidence, and frankly, he paused just long enough to let skepticism do its work, has not been produced by the defense in any prior discovery filing. If this evidence existed, counsel had an obligation to disclose it. Calloway looked at Cora. Cora stood. She looked like she hadn't slept in 2 days, which she hadn't, but her voice was steady. Your Honor, the EMS run report and the trauma unit property intake log were both requested in our initial discovery motion 7 months ago. We received a partial response. These specific documents were not included in what the prosecution turned over, because they're not relevant to Mr. Voss. Calloway's voice was flat. You'll wait your turn. Voss closed his mouth. A muscle in his jaw worked once, then stopped. Calloway turned back to Cora. You're saying these documents were requested and not produced? That's correct, Your Honor. We have the original discovery request on file. We also have the prosecution's response. The gap is documented. The judge was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent 22 years developing an instinct for when something in a courtroom had gone procedurally wrong versus when something had gone genuinely wrong, and Abigail watched him work through which category this was. She could see him not wanting it to be the second one. She could see him arriving there anyway. Ms. Hart, he said, turning back to her. The documents you're referencing, have you personally seen them? Yes, Your Honor. When? 3 weeks ago. Cora Vasquez obtained them through a direct request to the hospital's records department, independent of the discovery process. And they document a knife recovered from the alleged victim at the scene. They document a folding knife recovered from Preston Dahl's jacket by the paramedic who transported him. The paramedic's name is on the run report. The property intake at the trauma unit is countersigned by the receiving nurse. Calloway took off his glasses and set them on the bench in front of him, which seemed to be something he did when he needed a moment to think without the performance of thinking. The courtroom gave him the moment. Even Voss was quiet. Mr. Voss, Calloway said finally, I'm going to need your office to explain the gap in the discovery production. Today, before we go any further. Your Honor, with respect, the defense is introducing an entirely new... I understand what the defense is doing. What I don't understand is why documents that were requested 7 months ago are being introduced from the witness stand rather than the evidence table. He looked at Voss in a way that was not angry, precisely, but that was the precursor to angry, the careful, considered version that came before a man decided to stop being careful. That's not the defense's problem to solve. That's yours. Voss straightened. I'll need time to confer with the investigating detectives. You'll have the lunch recess. Calloway checked the clock on the wall. It's 10:47. We'll break at noon. I expect answers, not conferring. He put his glasses back on and looked at Abigail. You may step down, Ms. Hart. I'm not excusing you. You'll be recalled. She stepped down from the witness stand. Her legs were steady and her hands were steady, and she moved back to the seat Cora had indicated for her in the gallery, and it was only when she sat and the adrenaline began the slow process of leaving her body that she registered how exhausted she actually was. Not the manageable exhaustion of a long shift, the kind she'd learned to work inside of. Something deeper. The kind that accumulated over months of caring about something that kept almost going wrong. Ethan turned from the defense table and looked at her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Behind her, in the front row, General Holloway sat with his hands folded and his face arranged in the particular stillness of a man who was watching something he'd been waiting a long time to see. The morning session dissolved into controlled chaos, the kind that looked orderly from the outside but was anything but. Voss pulled both detectives into the hallway. Cora spread documents across the defense table and had a rapid conversation with her paralegal, a young man named Theo who had been running discovery records for 6 months and looked like he was finally seeing the reason for all of it. 2 jurors in the back row were speaking to each other in low voices before the bailiff reminded them they weren't supposed to. Abigail sat and watched all of it and felt the strange double vision of being both inside a situation and outside it, the observer's distance that good trauma nurses developed over years of operating in rooms where everything was happening at once, and you had to track all of it without being consumed by any piece of it. Holloway appeared beside her sometime in the next few minutes, lowering himself into the seat to her left with the deliberateness of a large man managing a formal uniform in a public space. You look terrible, he said. 26 hours, she said. How's the hospital? Short-staffed, like always. He was quiet for a moment. Around them the room was still moving, attorneys, bailiffs, the low current of the gallery reorganizing itself around what had just happened. I got a call this morning from an attorney named Vasquez. She said you were going to be here and that there might be a situation. She called you. She's resourceful. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Holloway's face didn't do conventional smiles, but an approximation. I almost didn't come. I told myself it was probably nothing. But you came. I came. He looked at his hands. I've been carrying the report from Karada for 12 years. The part where Ghost Medic 7 goes off-grid in the extraction zone and everyone assumes she's KIA. He said it the way people describe things they'd spent a long time learning to describe without feeling. You were listed as missing. There was never a body recovery. But you don't list someone as alive when the alternative explanation is more defensible. The alternative explanation had its uses, she said, for a while. He nodded once, accepting this without needing to understand it fully. That was something she'd always appreciated about Holloway. He had learned over a long career that there were things he wasn't entitled to understand completely, and he'd made a practical peace with that. The knife, he said. It exists. And the family connection to the detectives? She looked at him. You've been doing your homework. I had 3 hours in the car. She said, Stuart Dahl contributed to 6 Police Foundation fundraisers in the last 4 years. Detective Falco's name appears in the thank you acknowledgments of 2 of them. The other detective, his name is Reyes, coached youth football with Dahl's brother-in-law for 3 seasons. She paused. None of that is illegal. None of it is even unusual. But when you put it next to the missing evidence, it stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern. Holloway was quiet again. Then, does the defense have that?
Cora has part of it. I've been compiling the rest.
She looked at her hands. The blood was drying now, browning at the edges. She should have washed them. I didn't want to put it all in front of a jury before I understood what we were dealing with. Presenting half a pattern is worse than presenting nothing. It gives them something to poke holes in. And now? Now the knife is on the record. Now the judge knows the discovery is incomplete. Now, she stopped. Across the room, through the small window in the courtroom's side door, she could see Voss and Falco in the hallway. Voss was speaking. Falco was not speaking. Falco had the look of a man who was very carefully not saying anything because everything he might say would make his situation worse, and he was experienced enough to know it. Reyes, the second detective, was standing slightly apart from both of them. His arms were crossed and his eyes were on the floor, and his posture had the specific quality of a man who had agreed to something a long time ago and was only now fully understanding the cost of it. "Now it's different," Abigail said. The noon recess came and she used it to wash her hands in the third-floor bathroom and eat half a granola bar she found at the bottom of her jacket pocket and sit on a bench in the hallway for 12 minutes with her eyes closed, not sleeping but doing the closest approximation of it that the situation allowed. She was aware of people moving around her, attorneys, courthouse staff, a family waiting for a different proceeding down the hall, and she let all of it wash past without engaging any of it. Cora found her at 11:58 and sat down beside her. "He's going to ask for a continuance," she said without preamble. Abigail opened her eyes. "Voss? He wants 2 weeks to review the discovery record. His words." Cora's voice carried the precise flatness of someone managing a legitimate fury. 2 weeks? Ethan's been living with this for 8 months. He lost his apartment. He lost his job. His credit is... She stopped. 2 weeks. Calloway won't give it to him. You don't know that. No, Abigail said, but I know that man looked at an incomplete discovery record this morning and didn't like what it told him about his courtroom. Judges don't like being the last to know. She looked at Cora. How's Ethan? Holding. Cora said it the way you said it about someone who was doing the only thing they could do and doing it badly. He keeps apologizing to me. For what? I have no idea. For needing help, Abigail said. He's not good at that. They went back inside. Voss requested the continuance. He framed it carefully, professionally, with the full weight of his considerable courtroom experience behind it. This was about procedural integrity, he said, about ensuring the record was complete before the jury deliberated, about fairness to all parties. Calloway denied it in 11 words. The trial is proceeding. We'll address the discovery issue and evidence. He looked at Voss with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was not interested in revisiting it. Call your next witness, Mr. Voss, or rest your case. Voss stood very still for one moment. Then he turned to the prosecution table and picked up a folder. The prosecution recalls Detective Falco. Falco came back to the stand. He had the look of a man who had spent the lunch recess being told what to say, and the worst look of a man who wasn't entirely sure he could say it. Voss asked him about the discovery process, about what documents had been produced and what hadn't, about the EMS run report specifically. Falco said he hadn't been aware the run report contained information about a recovered item. You weren't aware, Voss repeated. That's correct. And the trauma unit property log? That would have been produced by the hospital, not by our department. So the absence of those documents from the discovery production is not something your department can account for. Falco looked at Voss. Then he looked at his hands. Correct. It was a technically defensible answer. It was also in the specific way that technically defensible answers sometimes were. The most damaging thing he could have said, because it implied that the documents had existed, had been knowable, and had simply not made it into the packet, which raised the question of why. Cora was on her feet the moment Voss sat down. Detective Falco, you were the lead investigator on this case. That's correct. As lead investigator, you would have been responsible for coordinating with EMS and the receiving trauma unit regarding any evidence connected to the incident. Standard procedure, yes. Did you request the EMS run report? A pause. Small, but present. I reviewed the EMS response summary. I asked if you requested the run report, the full report.
Another pause. I don't recall specifically requesting the full run report. Cora let that sit for 3 seconds. In a courtroom, 3 seconds was a long time.
Detective, are you aware that the EMS run report for this incident documents a folding knife recovered from the patient's jacket during transport? I've been made aware this morning, yes. You were not aware of it during your investigation. I was not. And the weapon, the knife, was it recovered as part of your investigation? Did you request it from the trauma unit? Falco looked at the prosecution table. Voss was writing something on a notepad with great deliberate focus. He didn't look up. It was not recovered as part of the investigation, Falco said. Was it logged into evidence by your department? No. Do you know where it is now? I do not. Cora nodded slowly, the nod of someone filing information away rather than reacting to it. Nothing further, she said, and sat down. The silence in the courtroom had a different quality than it had that morning. That morning, it had been the silence of people watching something unexpected. Now it was the silence of people watching something inevitable. The kind of thing that once started couldn't be stopped, that gathered momentum the way water gathered momentum. Not suddenly, but in a way that made stopping feel increasingly theoretical. Falco stepped down. He didn't look at the gallery. He didn't look at Reyes, who was still seated behind the prosecution table, still studying the floor with the intensity of a man looking for a way out of himself. Voss rested the prosecution's case, and Abigail was recalled to the stand. Cora brought her through the medical analysis slowly and precisely, the way you did when you wanted a jury to follow something complex without losing them in the complexity. Abigail had done this before: expert testimony, depositions, the specific discipline of translating clinical knowledge into language that worked for people who hadn't spent years inside it. She was good at it, not because she was naturally gifted at public communication, but because she had learned, the hard way, that the difference between being understood and not being understood was almost never about intelligence. It was about whether the person speaking had taken the time to stand in the other person's position and figure out what the explanation needed to look like from there. She described the injuries documented in the trauma unit's records. The jaw strike, a single, controlled impact to a specific point that produced temporary disorientation without fracture. The takedown, consistent with a controlled shoulder throw, the kind of technique that prioritized speed and control over damage. The abraded palm on Dahl's right hand, which was not consistent with being grabbed from behind in a defensive scenario, but was very consistent with someone who had been holding something and dropped it suddenly when a physical confrontation ended. In your assessment, Cora said, are these injuries consistent with an unprovoked attack? No. What are they consistent with? Threat neutralization? Controlled, targeted, minimal. The intent was to stop the situation, not to damage the individual. And the subsequent actions documented by the paramedics, the airway management, are consistent with someone who neutralized a threat and then immediately shifted to responsibility for the outcome. She said it the same way she'd said it that morning, because it was still true, and because some things bore repeating precisely. You don't manage someone's airway if you're trying to hurt them. You manage their airway because you're trying to keep them alive. Voss's cross was pointed and well-prepared and didn't land the way he'd planned it. He pushed on her qualifications. She hadn't been in the military for 13 years. Medical practice evolved. Her assessment was based on documents rather than direct examination. She acknowledged each of these points and returned to the documentation each time, because the documentation was what it was, and neither of them could change it. At one point, Voss said, "Isn't it possible, Ms. Hart, that someone with Mr. Brooks's training could have performed these actions automatically, without conscious control? In a hypervigilant state, unable to distinguish a real threat from a perceived one?" She looked at him. She'd been expecting some version of this question since Dr. Winslow had testified. "Possible in theory," she said, "inconsistent with the evidence. Hypervigilant threat response doesn't include a controlled single-impact strike followed by a non-damaging takedown, followed by airway management. Hypervigilant threat response is not surgical. What the documentation describes is surgical." Voss tried twice more and then sat down, and from the prosecution table, Abigail could hear the pen he was holding tap once, twice, 3 times against the legal pad before going still. She stepped down for the second time. The afternoon was a long one. Cora called the trauma unit physician, Dr. Sienna Marks, who had been Abigail's contact for the past 6 months, and who testified with the clipped efficiency of someone with 3 surgeries scheduled for the next morning and approximately no patients for theater. She confirmed the property log. She confirmed the knife's documentation. She confirmed, under a cross-examination that Voss seemed to have lost enthusiasm for, that the injury pattern she'd observed was inconsistent with the prosecution's account of the incident. Then Cora did something Abigail hadn't expected. She called Reyes, not Falco. Reyes, the second detective, the one who had been studying the floor. Voss objected immediately, strenuously, and in terms that suggested he was alarmed in a way that he didn't want to show but couldn't entirely conceal. The defense couldn't call a prosecution investigator without Mr. Reyes is listed as a potential witness in the defense's original disclosure, Cora said, and held up a document. Filed 8 months ago. Calloway looked at the document, looked at Voss. Objection overruled. Reyes came to the stand. He sat down with the careful movements of a man who was not at all sure he wanted to be where he was. He was 52, heavy-set, with the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and still carried the structure of it beneath the accumulated weight of subsequent years. He looked at Cora. He did not look at Falco. Cora began simply. She walked him through the investigation timeline, the initial response, the interviews, the evidence collection. She was methodical and unhurried and completely without aggression, which Abigail recognized as deliberate. You didn't attack a witness who might give you something if you created the conditions for him to give it freely. And then she asked, quietly, without emphasis, Detective Reyes, were you present when the decision was made not to include the EMS run report in the discovery production? The courtroom air changed. Reyes looked at the table in front of him, then at the wall to his left, then at his hands. I want to be careful, he said, about how I answer that. Take whatever time you need, Cora said, and she meant it. Reyes was quiet for 11 seconds. Abigail counted without meaning to. It was a habit from years of tracking vitals, of understanding that time in crisis had a texture that normal time didn't, that 11 seconds of a person's silence before they answered a question like that one was not empty time. It was the sound of a choice being made. I was aware, Reyes said, that a decision had been made about which documents to include. And were you part of that decision? I was present when it was discussed. Who else was present? Voss was on his feet. Objection. Sit down, Mr. Voss. Calloway's voice had gone to a place past cold now, a place that Abigail associated with judges who had stopped being irritated and started being angry, which was something else entirely. He looked at Reyes. Answer the question, detective. Reyes looked at the back wall of the courtroom for a long moment. Abigail followed his gaze without meaning to. There was nothing there. Just paneling, just the dull wood that had absorbed 22 years of proceedings. But people looked at walls when they were looking for something that wasn't in the room. Then he looked at Falco, and then he looked at Cora. Falco, he said. And a man named Broderick. He's not a detective. He works for Stuart Dahl. The sound that moved through the courtroom then was not a gasp. It was something quieter and more final, the collective intake of breath of people who had suspected something and had just had the suspicion confirmed in plain language with a name attached. Voss had stopped objecting. He was standing at the prosecution table with his hand on the back of his chair, and Abigail could see him doing the calculation of someone who had just understood that the case he thought he was winning had been something else entirely from the beginning, and that he was now either a participant or a victim of that something, and he didn't yet know which one history was going to call him. Falco, in the gallery, did not move. His face had gone to a particular blankness that Abigail recognized from trauma cases, the dissociated stillness of a person whose nervous system had registered a catastrophic event and had not yet processed it into anything expressible. At the defense table, Ethan Brooks had both hands flat on the wood in front of him and was looking at Reyes with an expression that Abigail had not seen on his face before. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what Ethan carried. Something older than hope, something that had been waiting, compressed, for a very long time. In the front row of the gallery, General Holloway sat with his arms crossed and his medals catching what was left of the afternoon light through the courtroom's high windows. And he was looking at Abigail, not at the stand. And when she met his eyes briefly, she saw in them the specific satisfaction of a man who had driven 3 hours because something in him insisted and had not been wrong. Calloway looked down from the bench. He was very still. The pen in his hand was not moving. "Detective Reyes," he said, and his voice had something in it that had not been there that morning, a gravity that went past judicial formality into something personal, the voice of a man who understood that what was happening in his courtroom today was going to require him to decide what kind of judge he was. "Are you telling this court that a civilian with a financial interest in this case participated in decisions about the prosecution's evidence production?" Reyes's hands were flat on the witness box railing. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "That's what I'm telling you." The clock on the wall read 4:23, and somewhere in the courthouse, on a floor below them, a man named Broderick, who had arrived that morning expecting to watch an outcome that had been arranged and paid for, took out his phone and made a call that the person on the other end did not want to receive. The call Broderick made lasted 47 seconds. Abigail knew this because she was watching him through the narrow vertical window set into the courtroom's side door when he stepped into the fourth-floor corridor, and she had a clear sightline to his face, and she counted the seconds the way she counted everything, automatically, without deciding to, the way her brain had been rewired over years of operating in situations where time had consequences. 47 seconds. Then he ended the call and stood in the hallway with the phone pressed flat against his sternum, staring at nothing, and his face had the compressed, airless look of a man who had just been told that the plan was no longer the plan and that he was now responsible for what came next. She filed this away and turned back to the courtroom. Calloway had called a brief recess. The room was moving again, that particular courthouse motion of people in suits carrying folders with great urgency in all directions at once. But beneath the motion there was a stillness, the stillness of a situation that had fundamentally changed shape. People were recalibrating. The jurors had been escorted to the jury room, but before the door closed, she had watched 3 of them exchange looks that said more than anything said aloud in the preceding 4 hours. Cora was at the defense table talking quietly to Theo, her paralegal, who had his laptop open and was scrolling through something with the focused speed of a person who had been given a very specific task and understood why it mattered. Ethan was beside her, and Abigail noticed he had turned his chair slightly so that his back was no longer to the gallery. A small adjustment, meaningful. A man who had spent 8 months feeling exposed on all sides was unconsciously reducing the number of directions from which he could be approached. She understood that. She took her seat in the gallery, and Holloway appeared again in the seat to her left. "Broderick made a call," she said, without looking at him. "I saw. He's going to try to pull something before Calloway can formalize a request for investigation. If Stuart Dahl has any reach into the courthouse administrative structure, he has reach everywhere," Holloway said flatly. "That's not a theory. That's just what that level of money does." He paused. "What do you need?" "I need whatever Reyes knows to be on the record before anyone gets to him." Holloway looked at her sideways. "Cora's already thinking the same thing." "I know she is. I need it to happen faster than Cora's timeline." Holloway was quiet for a moment. Then he took out his phone and opened his contacts and made a call of his own, turning slightly away, his voice too low for the room to follow. She watched him without appearing to watch him, the way she watched patients when they didn't know she was assessing them, tracking, cataloging, building a picture from peripheral information. Whatever he said to whoever answered, it took 90 seconds. When he ended the call, he put the phone away and said, "Someone from the AG's office will be in the building within the hour." Abigail looked at him. "How?" "The AG's investigative unit has been looking at Stuart Dahl's business practices for 16 months. This is not the first courthouse his people have been in." He said it with the controlled absence of satisfaction that military men used when describing outcomes that confirmed their prior assessments. "They were waiting for a thread to pull. Reyes is a thread." The recess ended. Calloway came back to the bench and the room reassembled itself,
and Reyes returned to the witness stand, and Abigail watched his face as he settled into the chair and made the visible choice to keep going. He had a wife, she knew. Cora had mentioned it in passing months ago, the way background details accumulate during long preparation. 2 kids in high school, a pension 3 years from vesting. These were the things a man thought about when he was deciding how much truth to tell and at what cost. Whatever math he had done in the recess, the answer he'd arrived at was the same one he'd had before the break. Cora resumed. She was careful with him, the way you were careful with something that might break if you pressed too hard, but needed to hold if you pressed just right. She brought him back through the timeline of the evidence discussions, not demanding, not prosecutorial, just following the sequence with steady and relentless patience. Reyes told it the way people told things when they had decided to tell them, in pieces, in the order they'd happened, without editorializing, without the self-protective framing that people added when they were managing their exposure. Broderick had come to the precinct 2 days after the incident, not to the public entrance, to Falco's desk, through the staff entrance, which meant Falco had let him in. They had met in the break room. Reyes had been getting coffee and had seen the tail end of what appeared to be a document exchange. He hadn't thought much of it. Civilian consultants came through occasionally, insurance companies, corporate security people. Then the discovery production had been compiled, and Reyes had looked for the EMS report and been told by Falco that it wasn't relevant. The word relevant had snagged on something in his mind and stayed there. He'd pulled the report independently, read the notation about the recovered knife, and gone back to Falco. "What did he say?" Cora asked. "He said the knife wasn't connected to the assault. He said it was probably the victim's personal property, nothing to do with the incident." "Did you believe that?" Reyes looked at his hands. "I didn't not believe it. I wanted to not believe it." He stopped. "Those are different things. And you didn't push further." "No." The word landed simply, with no mitigation, which was its own kind of honesty. Voss cross-examined carefully. He focused on Reyes's uncertainty. He hadn't directly witnessed an explicit order to suppress evidence, had he? He hadn't seen Broderick hand Falco anything he could specifically identify as a directive. All of this was technically accurate, and none of it addressed the fact that Reyes had known something was wrong and had made the choice, for reasons he just described plainly, to let it go. The jury watched all of it. Abigail watched the jury. The woman in seat 4, a retired teacher named Barbara, according to the juror profiles Cora had shared during preparation, had not taken notes since Reyes began testifying. She'd put her pen down. This was not disengagement. This was the behavior of someone who no longer needed to write anything down because the thing they were hearing had moved past note-taking into the place where you simply understood. Reyes stepped down. Falco, in the gallery, had his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, and he had the look of a man who had already begun the long private process of damage calculation. Not guilt, necessarily, but the actuarial version of guilt, the accounting of what he was going to lose and in what order. Calloway called a 10-minute recess. Abigail stood and stretched and walked to the back of the courtroom, and that was when she saw the woman. She was standing just inside the rear door, half in and half out, as if she hadn't fully decided whether she was coming in or going back. She was in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back and the kind of face that had spent recent months carrying something heavy and hadn't yet put it down. She wore a gray cardigan over a blue dress, and she held a canvas bag in front of her with both hands like it was either luggage or a shield. Abigail couldn't tell which. She was looking at Ethan, not at the defense table, not at the bench. At Ethan specifically, with the particular intensity of someone who recognized a person in a way that required no introduction. Abigail walked toward her, not fast, not with any signal of urgency. She moved the way she moved in trauma bays when someone's blood pressure was dropping and you needed to reach them without accelerating the situation. She stopped about 4 feet away. "You were there," she said, quietly. Not a question. The woman looked at her. Her jaw tightened once, then released. "How did you—" "Your hands." Abigail glanced at them. The canvas bag handles were twisted, the fabric pulled taut. "You're holding on. People hold on when they've already been through something once and they're afraid of going through it again." She paused. "You're the woman from the parking structure."
The woman's eyes went briefly to the gallery door, the reflex of someone calculating exits. Then she looked back at Abigail. If I testify, no one can make you. His father knows people. Stuart Dahl knows. I know what he can do. My sister works for one of his companies. My landlord. She stopped. I'm not saying these are good reasons. They're real reasons, Abigail said. I'm not here to tell you they're not. The woman looked at her for a long moment. She had the look of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in the private theater of her own head for months, and found that the actual version was both easier and harder than the rehearsed one. He saved my life, she said. That man in there, and I let them charge him with a crime for it because I was... She stopped again. The word she didn't say was afraid, and not saying it was its own kind of truth. My name is Abigail, Abigail said. What's yours? Nadia Ferris. Nadia. The attorney at the defense table is named Cora Vasquez. She's good at this. She would want to talk to you. Abigail looked at her directly, not with pressure, just with the full attention of a person who is taking another person seriously. But nothing happens without your decision. You understand that. Nadia Ferris looked past her at the front of the courtroom, at the back of Ethan Brooks' head, where he sat at the defense table, straight-backed, patient, carrying the weight of 8 months of being defined by something that had never been true. What happens if I talk to her? Nadia said. Then she'll know what you saw, and she'll figure out whether it changes anything. Does it? Abigail considered this. The honest answer was yes. The complete answer was more complicated, because the complete answer was that it changed almost everything, and that was a weight Nadia Ferris would have to carry, and Abigail was not going to make that choice sound lighter than it was. It changes what the jury knows, Abigail said. After that, it's up to them. Nadia looked at the canvas bag in her hands. Then she looked up. Okay, she said. Okay. Get me the attorney. Abigail found Cora in the hallway outside the courtroom during the final minutes of the recess. Cora's reaction lasted approximately 2 seconds, a brief, total stillness, the response of a mind that had just received significant new information and was immediately rerouting, and then she was moving toward the rear of the courtroom with the focused speed of someone who had learned that windows closed and needed to be used when they appeared. The recess ended before Cora had finished talking to Nadia, and Calloway came back to the bench and called the session to order, and Cora came through the rear door and approached the bench and said something to Calloway in a voice too low for the gallery. Calloway looked at her, then at the rear of the courtroom, then at Voss. Mr. Voss, he said, the defense has a late witness. I'm inclined to allow it. Voss stood. He looked like a man who had stopped being surprised by bad news and had moved into the territory beyond it, where you simply processed each new development with whatever energy you had left. On what grounds, Your Honor? On the grounds that it appears to bear directly on the facts at issue and that its late emergence is not attributable to the defense's negligence. Calloway looked at both of them with the expression of a man who had made his decision and was not interested in extensive discussion. You'll have your cross, Mr. Voss. That's the balance. Nadia Ferris took the stand. She was nervous in a visible way. Her hands on the railing were not steady, and she looked at the jury only intermittently before her eyes returned to the middle distance. But nervous was not the same as unreliable, and Abigail had learned over many years that juries knew this, that jurors who were themselves ordinary people in ordinary lives recognized the texture of a person who was frightened but telling the truth as opposed to the texture of a person who was performing. Cora walked her through it gently and without apparent urgency, letting the sequence establish itself in the jury's mind at the pace of someone narrating something they'd seen rather than a story they'd been coached to tell. Nadia had been walking to her car on a Tuesday evening. She'd heard the altercation before she saw it. A man's voice, raised, then a woman's cry. She'd come around the corner of the parking structure's second level and seen a man she identified now as Preston Dahl with his hand in a woman's hair. She hadn't seen the other woman's face. She'd stopped, frozen, the freeze response that people who had never been in violent situations sometimes had, and that no amount of knowing better could prevent. Then Ethan had appeared from the stairwell on the far side of the level. He didn't run, Nadia said. I thought he might run. I don't know why I thought that. He walked toward them, like he was walking somewhere specific, She frowned slightly, the frown of someone reconstructing a memory they'd gone over many times. He said something to the man. I couldn't hear what. Then it was very fast. It was over fast. I didn't even see all of it. What did you see after? The man was on the ground, and she stopped, collected herself. And the veteran, the one there, she glanced toward Ethan, then back at Cora. He was kneeling next to him. He had his fingers in the man's mouth, and I thought, that's strange. I thought, why would you do that if you were trying to hurt someone? She looked at the jury. You wouldn't. That's not what it looks like to hurt someone. The woman in seat 4 had put her pen back down. She wasn't taking notes. She was watching Nadia Ferris with the absolute attention of someone hearing the thing they had been waiting to hear. Did you see anything else? Cora asked. Before Mr. Brooks arrived. On Mr. Dahl's person. Nadia's hands tightened slightly on the railing. He had a knife. He had it in his right hand when I came around the corner, one of those folding ones. He had it open. She looked at Cora. I was afraid he was going to use it on her. The courtroom was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Not the stunned silence of people processing something unexpected, but the settled silence of people whose understanding of a situation had just clicked completely into place. Voss's cross-examination lasted 14 minutes. He questioned the lighting in the structure. He questioned her vantage point. He asked whether she'd been under stress, whether she might have misidentified the object, whether a folding knife and a phone, say, might look similar in a parking structure at dusk. It was open, Nadia said. A phone doesn't have a blade. She said it quietly, without heat, and that was worse for Voss than anything contemptuous would have been, because contempt gave him something to work with, and quiet certainty didn't. He sat down. The sun coming through the courtroom's high windows had gone from afternoon gold to the flatter, cooler tone of late day. Somewhere in the building below them, Abigail knew, a man from the Attorney General's office had arrived and was being directed by Holloway's people to the 4th floor. She'd gotten a text from a number she didn't recognize that said only, "In the building." She'd put her phone away. Calloway looked at both tables. Anything further from the defense? Cora stood. The defense rests, Your Honor. Mr. Voss? Voss looked at his notes. He looked at them for a long time, long enough that it stopped being about the notes and became about the performance of considering options he no longer had. Then he set the legal pad down. The prosecution has no rebuttal witnesses, Your Honor. What happened next was supposed to be closing arguments. That was the procedure. That was the sequence that 22 years of Calloway's courtroom had followed in every case, the ordered progression toward deliberation. But Calloway did not call for closings. He looked at the room for a moment with an expression Abigail had not seen from him once in the preceding hours. Not authority, not impatience, not the contained contempt of that morning, something more uncomfortable. The expression of a man who was in the process of understanding his own role in something and not finding the understanding pleasant. Before we proceed to closing arguments, he said slowly, I want to address the matter of the discovery record. Voss's head came up. I'm going to be requesting that the clerk prepare a formal referral to the court's oversight office regarding the incomplete production. That referral will go out this evening. He looked at Voss. Mr. Voss, I want to be clear that I'm not presuming your direct involvement in the decisions that led to the incomplete production. But I am noting for the record that those decisions occurred under the prosecution's umbrella and that this court takes a serious view of discovery obligations. He paused. Serious. Voss said nothing. His face had the sealed, careful look of someone constructing a very particular kind of silence. We'll take a 30-minute recess before closings, Calloway said, and brought his gavel down. The room broke apart. Abigail was on her feet and moving toward the defense table before the sound of the gavel had finished its echo. Cora met her halfway, and they stood close together in the space between the gallery and the railing, and Cora said, We have him. Very quietly, with the controlled relief of someone who had believed something for months and had just had it confirmed. We don't have him yet, Abigail said. The jury hasn't decided anything. Closing arguments can move people. She looked at Cora. You know what you need to say. Cora nodded. She knew. She had known for months, had been building toward it. The summation that tied the evidence to the man in the chair, that turned testimony and documents and a witness's trembling hands into the coherent story of what had actually happened in that parking structure on a Tuesday evening. Ethan was standing now, and he looked at Abigail with the expression she'd seen on his face that morning when she'd come through the courtroom doors, the guarded, undemonstrative relief of a man who was not going to believe anything was over until it was over. "How are you doing?" she asked him. "I've had better 8 months," he said. It wasn't a joke exactly, but it had the shape of one, which was something. "Nadia Ferris," she said. "You know her?" He shook his head. "I didn't even know if she was real. When they took her statement and it came back," he stopped. "I figured she'd been talked to. Figured that was the end of it." "She wasn't talked to. She talked herself out of it." Abigail looked at him. "She's been carrying this for 8 months, too. Remember that when you see her." He looked past her toward the back of the courtroom where Nadia Ferris was seated now, alone, still holding the canvas bag, looking at nothing in particular with the washed-out expression of someone who had just expended a form of courage they hadn't known they had. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, once, to himself. The 30-minute recess was 22 minutes old when the courtroom's side door opened. Not the main doors, the side door that connected to the courthouse's internal corridor system. And a woman walked in who was not part of the existing cast of the afternoon. She was in her 40s, with close-cropped hair and a jacket that was professional without being a lawyer's professional. She carried a slim document folder and moved with the particular efficiency of someone who operated in institutions without being defined by them. She went directly to the bailiff and showed him something, a credential, quickly palmed, and the bailiff looked at it and looked at her and stepped aside. She walked to the front of the courtroom and positioned herself near the clerk's station and did not speak to anyone. Abigail recognized the type, had operated alongside the type years ago, in contexts that shared a certain operational DNA with what was unfolding here. The contained, purposeful stillness of someone who was present to witness something specific and ensure that it was correctly documented. Cora noticed her within 90 seconds. Abigail watched Cora take in the jacket, the folder, the credential and dismiss with the bailiff, and arrive at a conclusion. Cora looked at Abigail. Abigail gave a slight nod. The woman was from the AG's office. She was there for Broderick. Holloway appeared at Abigail's elbow. He had the look of someone managing several things at once and keeping all the plates in the air with effort but without display. "Reyes," he said quietly. "He's been asked to stay in the building. Does Falco know?" "Falco left the gallery 12 minutes ago." She turned to look. The seat where Falco had been sitting, 4th row, left side, 3 from the aisle, was empty. She hadn't seen him go. "Where?" "Unknown. A courthouse deputy is locating him." Holloway's voice was flat and unhurried, the voice of a man reporting facts. "He hasn't left the building. His car is still in the lot." This was not good. Not because Falco's location was a direct threat to anything happening in this courtroom. Nothing in this room required him to be present. Nothing in the proceedings was contingent on his cooperation. But a detective who had participated in evidence suppression, who had now heard his partner describe that participation from a witness stand, who had quietly left a gallery while everyone's attention was elsewhere. That was the behavior of a person running the arithmetic of their own exposure and reaching a number that frightened them. Frightened people with tactical training and knowledge of courthouse layout made specific kinds of decisions. Abigail was already moving before she'd fully articulated this analysis to herself. It was muscle memory, the same process that got her to a patient before she'd consciously decided to move, the same pattern recognition that had served her in situations where the difference between acting and deliberating was measured in outcomes. She went through the side door. The internal corridor was fluorescent lit and institutional, the kind of space that existed to connect other spaces and carried no identity of its own. It ran in both directions from the courtroom entrance. To her left, the main stairwell. To her right, a secondary corridor that led to the courthouse's administrative offices, and beyond those, the building's emergency stairwell. She went right. She found Falco at the end of the secondary corridor, standing in front of the emergency stairwell door. He had his phone in his hand and was staring at it, not dialing, just holding it. He looked up when she appeared. They looked at each other for a moment. He was 54, solid, with the kind of physical steadiness that came from years of field work. Not large, just settled into himself in a way that made him look harder to move than his size suggested. He did not look like a man who had been caught. He looked like a man who was deciding something. "Ms. Hart," he said. His voice was professionally neutral. It was the voice he used when he needed to be in control of a conversation. "Detective." She stopped about 8 feet from him. Close enough to talk, not close enough to crowd him. "You should come back inside." "I needed some air." "There's a woman from the AG's office in the courtroom." His jaw moved once. "I know." "And a deputy looking for you." "I know that too." He looked at the phone in his hand. "I'm trying to figure out who to call." "That depends what you're trying to accomplish." He looked at her with the expression of someone who had been in enough difficult conversations to be tired of them. "What would you know about what I'm trying to accomplish?" "Not much," she said. "I know you've been a detective for 21 years. I know the pension you're 3 years from vesting. I know you've got 2 commendations on record and 1 disciplinary note from 2019 that was expunged." She watched his face. "I know the difference between a man who set this up and a man who made a choice that someone else's money made easier." His eyes changed slightly. Not warmer, something that had been braced released a fraction. "That's a distinction without a difference," he said. "Not always." She kept her voice even. "Reyes made a different choice this afternoon. He's still in the building. He didn't run. Reyes didn't know as much, which means you know enough to help a lot more." She looked at him steadily. "Or you walk through that door, and whatever you think that buys you, you're doing it alone." Falco looked at the stairwell door, looked at the phone, looked at the fluorescent light above them that was starting to flicker at one end, the buzz of a tube going bad. Small, mundane, wrong detail in the middle of everything. He said, "Broderick brought me a number, cash, structured through a consulting LLC, plausibly deniable." He said it the way men confess things when they had already run out of alternatives and were only now recognizing it. "I didn't take it. I want you to understand that. I told myself I was just managing the discovery production, finding the floor of what I was required to include." "And the knife?" "The knife went to Broderick. I didn't put it in a drawer. I handed it over." He looked at his hands briefly. "Which is worse." "Yes," she said. "It is." He absorbed this without flinching. She respected that. "The AG's investigator," he said. "She's here for Broderick. She's here for everything. She'll take what she can get." He stood in the corridor for another long moment. The stairwell door was 2 feet behind him. She didn't move toward him. She didn't make any gesture that would compress the space or transform the conversation into something that felt like custody rather than choice. She had learned over many years of dealing with people in their worst moments that you couldn't force someone toward the right decision. You could only make sure they understood the full shape of the one they were making. "I need an attorney," he said. "There are phones in the lobby." He looked at her. Something passed across his face that was not quite the thing she'd expect from a man in his position. Not shame, exactly, and not calculation. More like the strange, exhausted clarity that sometimes appeared in people when the thing they had been avoiding for a long time was finally directly in front of them. "Ghost Medic 7, he said. "Holloway said that in there?" She said nothing. "I pulled the reference. Couldn't find anything, which means it's buried deep." He tilted his head slightly. "You know what I spent 21 years doing? Finding things people buried." "I know," she said. "Doesn't it—" He stopped, started again. "Doesn't it wear you out? Doing the right thing in rooms full of people who've decided the right thing isn't worth the cost?" She thought about the man she'd kept alive through the night, the one who'd coded 3 times and come back each time, and was now in a room at Mercy Crest, not yet knowing how close it had been. She thought about Ethan Brooks sitting straight-backed at a defense table for 8 months, carrying something that didn't belong to him. She thought about Nadia Ferris in the gallery with her canvas bag, and her trembling hands, and her yes. "Yes," she said, constantly. He held her gaze for one more second. Then he put his phone in his pocket and turned away from the stairwell door. They walked back down the corridor together toward the courtroom entrance, and neither of them said anything. And the fluorescent tube behind them continued its slow decline toward going dark, and from somewhere below them in the building came the sound of movement. Not the ordinary movement of a courthouse at the end of its day, but the specific, purposeful movement of multiple people going somewhere with intention, the sound that Abigail's nervous system recognized before her conscious mind named it. She reached for the door handle, and her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. The number was the same number that had sent in the building. The message was 4 words. Broderick is in custody. She pushed open the door. The courtroom was not the same room she had left 22 minutes ago. The AG's investigator was still near the clerk's station, but she was no longer alone. There were 2 men in dark jackets with her now, and they were talking to Cora with an urgency that Cora was receiving with the alert, controlled attention of someone who understood that what was being said to her was important and required her immediate response. Holloway was standing. He had the look of a man whose information had just been confirmed. Calloway was at the bench, even though the recess was not formally over, and he was reading something that had been handed to him, a document, several pages, which he was going through with the focused, rapid attention of a man who was being briefed on something he had not expected to be briefed on today. At the defense table, Ethan Brooks was watching all of it with the stillness of a man who had stopped trying to interpret what was happening and was simply letting it arrive. In the rear of the courtroom, Nadia Ferris had set her canvas bag down on the seat beside her and was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the front of the room, and her face had the open, undefended look of someone who had put down something heavy enough that putting it down had changed how they held themselves. Falco walked in behind Abigail and stopped just inside the door. Cora saw him. She looked at Abigail. Abigail gave her a single nod. Cora turned back to the AG's investigator and said something short, and the investigator looked past her at Falco with the measured professional attention of someone adding a name to a list. And then Calloway looked up from the document in his hands, and his eyes moved across the room, across Falco at the door, across Holloway standing in the gallery, across the AG's people at the clerk's station, across Ethan Brooks at the defense table, and landed finally on Abigail, who was standing at the rear of the courtroom in blood-stained scrubs and a battered military jacket with 27 hours without sleep behind her and a knowledge of exactly what that document in the judge's hands contained, because she had read it 3 weeks ago. She had found it herself in the property records of Maricopa County's medical examiner's office, cross-referenced against a chain of custody form that had been filed in the wrong department's archive, and she had given it to Cora, and Cora had given it to the AG's office, and the AG's office had spent 3 weeks verifying it before acting on it. It was not the knife. The knife was important. The knife was evidence of the attack and evidence of the cover-up, and would matter in everything that came next. But what Calloway was holding was something else. It was a call log. 31 calls between Stuart Dahl's personal cell number and a line registered to a shell company, made over the 4 days following the incident in the parking structure. The calls lasted between 90 seconds and 11 minutes. The line registered to the shell company resolved through 2 layers of corporate registration to a number that was active in the Maricopa County Courthouse's internal directory. The number belonged to a clerk in the Judicial Assignment Office, the clerk who had assigned this case to Judge Richard Calloway. Calloway's face had gone through several iterations as he'd read the document. Abigail had been watching since she came through the door. It had started with the careful neutrality of a judge receiving new evidence, moved through something that looked like confusion, and arrived somewhere that looked like a man understanding something about his own courtroom, about his own role in something, that he had not understood this morning and wished now that he still did not. He set the document down. He looked at the defense table, then at the prosecution table, then at the room. He said slowly, "I'm going to need everyone to remain in this courtroom." Nobody moved. Not immediately. The instruction landed in the room the way Calloway's instructions always landed, with the weight of 22 years behind it, but this time the weight was different, freighted with something the room hadn't heard from him before. Not authority. Something closer to its opposite.
A man using the tools of authority because they were the only tools he had in a moment when he was no longer sure he deserved them. The AG's investigator, her name was Drummond, Abigail had caught it in passing, looked at the two men beside her and gave a small nod, and both of them moved to different positions in the room in a way that was not aggressive but was unmistakably deliberate. One near the main doors, one near the side entrance, not blocking them, just present. Falco stood inside the rear door where Abigail had left him. He had not sat down. He was looking at the front of the room with the expression of a man watching the last possible version of his previous life recede and doing the math on what replaced it. Calloway set down the document and looked at Drummond. "You'll need to walk me through the provenance of this." "Happy to, Your Honor." Drummond came forward, and her voice had the practiced calm of someone who testified in front of judges regularly and had long since stopped finding it intimidating. The call log was obtained through a lawful intercept warrant issued 14 months ago as part of an ongoing investigation into Stuart Dahl's business operations. The warrant covered communications across multiple registered and unregistered lines, and the line resolving to the Judicial Assignment Office. It was identified 9 days ago when our analysts cross-referenced the Dahl call records against county directory listings. She paused. "We notified your chief administrative judge at 7 this morning." Calloway absorbed this. "Before this trial began today." "Yes, Your Honor." The room processed this with a silence that had a particular quality, the silence of people recalculating not just what they knew, but what everyone else had known and when. Abigail watched Voss, who was standing very still at the prosecution table with both hands flat on it, and she could see him doing the same calculation she was, arriving at the same conclusion. The AG's office had known about the call log this morning, had known about the potential corruption in the case assignment, and had let the trial proceed because letting it proceed was how you built the complete record. You didn't intervene before the evidence was on the table. You waited until the evidence was on the table, and then you intervened with everything. Voss sat down slowly. He picked up his pen and put it down again. Cora, at the defense table, was not performing restraint. She was simply watching, the way people watched when they had worked very long and very hard for something and were allowing themselves carefully to believe it might be real. Ethan had turned in his chair to look at Abigail. She met his eyes and held them for a moment, and then she looked away, because there was nothing she could say across that distance that the moment didn't already contain. Calloway said, "I'm recusing myself from this case effective immediately." The sound that moved through the room was not dramatic. It was almost nothing, a collective exhale, a shift of weight, the specific audio of an outcome becoming real. "Given the nature of the information presented," Calloway continued, and his voice was controlled in a way that cost him something, she could hear the cost of it, "I cannot be confident that my assignment to this case was procedurally clean. I won't proceed on a case where that question exists." He looked at the jury box, at the 12 people who had been sitting through all of this with the contained, focused attention of people who understood they were witnessing something that went past what they'd expected when they'd received their jury summons. "I apologize to the members of the jury for the disruption to your time and your service. Your participation in these proceedings has been noted and is valued. You will be dismissed with the court's thanks." He looked at both tables. "A new judge will be assigned through a randomized process overseen by the AG's office. That assignment will occur tomorrow morning." He paused. "The defendant remains on the existing bail conditions. We are adjourned." The gavel came down, and the room, which had held its shape through 7 hours of escalating pressure, finally broke open. It broke open the way rooms did after something significant, not with noise exactly, but with motion, the sudden release of people who had been held still by the requirement of paying attention. The jury filed out. The bailiff moved. The gallery began to reorganize itself. Drummond and her colleagues moved toward Falco with the measured efficiency of people with a clear next task. Cora reached Ethan in 4 steps and said something to him, and whatever she said made him put his hand over his face for a moment, not to hide, just to have somewhere to put the expression that had come up, involuntary, the expression of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told he could set it down. He set it down. Not gracefully,
His shoulders dropped and his head dropped, and he sat in the chair at the defense table in a room that was coming apart around him and let 8 months of it move through him without trying to manage it. And Cora put her hand on his shoulder and left it there, and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say. Abigail watched from the rear of the room and did not go to him. She would, in a few minutes. But this was his and Cora's, and it needed the space it needed. Holloway appeared at her side. He said nothing for a moment, and she said nothing, and they stood together in the back of courtroom 7 while the controlled disassembly of a conspiracy happened around them, and the late afternoon light through the high windows went the color of old brass. "The clerk," Holloway said finally. "The one in the assignment office. Drummond will have her within the hour." "And Stuart Dahl?" "Is in his office in Scottsdale right now, according to the AG's people. He's been under surveillance since yesterday." She looked at Holloway. "They were waiting for today. They needed the trial record, Reyes's testimony, the knife documentation, Nadia Ferris. They needed it on the record before they moved." Holloway nodded once. He understood the logic. It was the same logic you applied to field operations. You didn't neutralize the target before you'd secured the objective, because without the objective, the neutralization was just noise. "The trial proceeds tomorrow," he said, "with a new judge and everything on the record." She looked at the defense table, at Ethan still sitting with Cora's hand on his shoulder. "It'll be different tomorrow." "Will you be there?" She thought about Mercy Crest, about the man who had coded 3 times, who was in a room right now either improving or not, about the teenager with the GSU who had cried for his mother, about the overnight shift that started at 7, which was in, she checked the clock, 11 hours. "I'll be there," she said. The next 40 minutes were the particular kind of organized chaos that followed the collapse of something structured. Drummond's team worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had been preparing for this specific afternoon for a long time, and everything they did had the character of a sequence being executed rather than improvised. Forms were signed, statements were requested. The bailiff coordinated with courthouse security about the physical chain of custody for the documents that had been introduced into evidence, because those documents were now evidence in something larger than the case they'd been introduced for. Falco did not resist. He stood where Drummond's colleagues positioned him and answered the initial questions they asked in a voice that had gone flat and factual, the voice of a man who had made his decision in the corridor and was executing it without second-guessing. A defense attorney would arrive within the hour, someone he'd apparently had the presence of mind to call during the recess. Until then, he said only what was directly asked and nothing more. Abigail respected the discipline of it, even now. Reyes was still in the building. He was in a conference room on the 2nd floor, also with Drummond's people, and the impression she got from the brief exchange she'd had with one of the investigators in the corridor was that Reyes was being considerably more forthcoming than Falco, which made sense given that Reyes had less to protect and more to gain from cooperation, and had already demonstrated in the witness box that he'd arrived at his threshold. She was in the hallway outside courtroom 7 when Drummond found her. "Ms. Hart." Drummond had the folder under her arm and the sharp, assessing look of someone who operated on compressed timelines and didn't waste the opening moves of a conversation. "I have a few questions, if you have a few minutes." "I have a few minutes." "The call log. How did you identify the significance of the shell company connection?" Abigail looked at her. "I went looking for it." "That's not a methodology." "No," Abigail agreed. "The methodology was, I found the chain of custody form in the wrong department's archive, matched the filing date to the window when the knife should have entered evidence, traced the associated property number through the county medical examiner's cross-reference system, and found that the registered disposal record for that property number was signed by someone whose employment record placed them in the Dahl organization's contracting network." She paused. "From there, the shell company was in the disposal record's letterhead. The call log connection was yours to make, not mine." Drummond looked at her with an expression that was not quite impressed. She was not the kind of person who displayed impression, but was recalibrated. "You did this in what time frame?" 3 weeks. Evenings. Days off." "You work nights at a hospital?" "Mercy Crest General, yes." Drummond looked at the folder under her arm, then at Abigail. "We may need a formal statement." "You know where to find me."
Abigail looked down the hallway toward the elevator bank where Cora and Ethan had appeared. Ethan in his coat, Cora with her briefcase, both of them looking like people who had just come through something and hadn't yet processed what being through it actually felt like. "I need to speak with my client's attorney before I go." Drummond followed her gaze. "He's not your client." "No," Abigail said. "He's not." She walked down the hallway. Ethan saw her coming and stopped walking and waited, which was the thing he did. He waited. He didn't move toward things. He let them arrive. She had understood from early on that this was not coldness, but its structural opposite. The discipline of a man who had learned not to reach for things because reaching sometimes made them recede. She stopped in front of him. "The new judge," he said. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she confirmed. "Cora says she says the record is what it is now." He looked at his hands. "She says it's enough." "It's more than enough." He was quiet for a moment. The hallway had the particular acoustic quality of a courthouse corridor. The voices, the footsteps, the ambient noise of an institution processing its end of day. And inside all of it, Ethan Brooks stood with his hands at his sides and the look of a man trying to find his footing in terrain that had, without warning, become navigable. "I want you to know something," he said. "When I walked into that parking structure, I didn't make a calculation. I didn't think about training or response protocols or any of that." He looked at her. "I just saw someone who was going to get hurt. That's all it was." "I know," she said. "I need someone to know that." "I know," she said again, and she meant both iterations, and he understood both. Cora put a hand briefly on Abigail's arm. "Thank you," she said, with the simplicity of someone for whom those two words were doing significant work. "Don't thank me yet," Abigail said. "Thank me tomorrow afternoon." She took the elevator down and walked out through the courthouse's main entrance into a Phoenix evening that had turned the sky the particular burnt orange that the desert produced in late July, as if compensating for the brutality of the day with something visually generous. The heat had not broken. It never broke before 10 in this city. She had lived here long enough to have stopped expecting it. But the angle of it had changed, the direct assault of midday replaced by something more ambient, more bearable. She sat on the courthouse steps for 4 minutes. She did this not because she was tired, though she was, 28 hours now, running on controlled attention and whatever the granola bar had contributed, but because she needed the brief liminal space between the interior of what had just happened and the exterior of everything still to come. She had learned this from years of shift work. The transition mattered. You couldn't carry a trauma bay into a grocery store without doing something to yourself in the process. She took 4 minutes. She watched a pigeon investigate the base of a parking meter. She let the sounds of the street settle into something she wasn't tracking. Then she stood up and went to find her car. She was 2 blocks from the courthouse, on the sidewalk, when her phone rang. The number was the desk line at Mercy Crest, which meant it was the charge nurse, which meant it was not optional. "Hart," she answered. "It's Pauline." The charge nurse's voice had the practical, unsentimental quality of someone delivering information rather than having a conversation. "The man from last night, Whitmore, he's asking for you." "Is he stable?" "More or less. He's post-extubation, comfortable. He's been asking since he came around." A pause. "He seems to think you talked to him through the night." "I did." "He doesn't remember most of it. He says he remembers a voice." Abigail looked at the street around her. The parking meter pigeon had followed her, or a different one had materialized. She couldn't tell. The evening was still very warm and very orange and very much a specific Phoenix evening, the kind that was its own thing regardless of what you'd been doing inside. "Tell him I'll come by before my shift," she said. "You're not scheduled until 7. "I know when I'm scheduled, Pauline." A brief pause that contained what Pauline thought about this. "Fine. I'll tell him." She ended the call. Abigail put her phone away and kept walking. She reached her car and got in and sat without starting it for a moment, in the specific silence of a person who had been performing competence and steadiness for a very long time in a single day and had now run out of audience. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That was not the issue. The issue was the thing she never said to anyone about this kind of work. Not the hospital work, but this kind.
The kind she'd spent 6 months doing in evenings and on days off. The kind that required you to care about an outcome so specifically that it lived in you constantly, that you woke up thinking about it and fell asleep turning it over, that you built toward it one document and one conversation and one careful question at a time. The issue was that caring that specifically about something, for that long, left a residue when it resolved. Not emptiness exactly. More like the feeling after a long physical effort, not unpleasant, but present, and requiring acknowledgement. She acknowledged it. Briefly, privately, in the front seat of her car in the parking lot 2 blocks from the Maricopa County Superior Courthouse. Then she started the engine and drove. She stopped at a diner she knew on the route home, a place she'd been going for 7 years, the kind of place with vinyl seats and a counter, and coffee that came in mugs with no handles, consistently bad in a way that had become consistent enough to be comforting. She ordered eggs and ate them at the counter and did not think about anything in particular for 20 minutes, which was its own kind of skill, and one she'd had to practice. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. Abigail had been coming here long enough that the waitress knew things about her she'd never said directly, that she worked nights, that she sat at the counter rather than a booth, that she never ordered dessert but would sometimes take a piece of pie home in a box if they had the cherry. Long day, the waitress said. Her name was Dorothea, and she was 61 and had been on this shift since Abigail had first sat at this counter. Longer than average, Abigail said. You have that look. Which look? Dorothea considered. The one where you got through it and you're not sure how yet. Abigail looked at the coffee in her handleless mug. That's a specific look. You've had it before, after bad nights at the hospital mostly. She thought about this, about what it meant to have a look that someone who poured her coffee could read, about the ways people left evidence of themselves in the world without intending to. I'll take a piece of the cherry pie, she said. 4 home. She got home at 8:40, showered, and slept for 5 hours with the particular depth of someone whose body had decided that the debt was being called in, regardless of what the mind preferred. She woke at 1:50 without an alarm, which was normal. She had not used an alarm since her first deployment, had trained herself out of it in the same way she'd trained herself out of other dependencies on external prompts. She lay in the dark for a few minutes, assembling the shape of the day behind her and the day ahead. Tomorrow Ethan would have a new judge. The case was not decided yet. She knew better than to call it decided. A new judge meant a new variable, a new temperament, a new set of reflexes applied to the record that had been built yesterday. The record was strong. It was, in her assessment, more than strong. But strong records encountered bad days. She had seen it. Cora had seen it. You did not count things finished until they were finished. But Reyes's testimony was on the record. Nadia Ferris's testimony was on the record. The knife's documentation was on the record. The call log was in the court file. Broderick was in custody. The judicial assignment clerk, whose name turned out to be Janet Moss, 27 years in the county system, who had taken $11,000 to ensure this case landed with Callaway specifically, was cooperating with the AG's office as of 10 o'clock last night, according to a text Drummond had sent Cora, which Cora had forwarded to Abigail at 11:15 with no comment attached. And Stuart Dahl, who had taken a call from Broderick yesterday afternoon and had not yet been told that Broderick had been arrested, who had spent the night in his house in Paradise Valley, presumably believing that the trial had gone badly, but not catastrophically, who was not yet aware of the full shape of what was on the record, would be meeting with federal investigators this morning. She knew this because Holloway had called at 9 the previous evening and told her briefly the way Holloway communicated, in the minimum number of words the information required. Treasury and the AG are coordinating, he'd said. The business practices investigation has enough to move. The trial record accelerated the timeline. When? Morning. She'd said okay and ended the call. Now she lay in the dark at 1:50 in the morning and let all of it settle into its proper arrangement, the way you let a scene settle after you'd worked in it. Not examining it, just allowing it to be what it was, to take up the space it actually occupied rather than the space you'd been projecting onto it. At 2:15, she got up and drove to Mercy Crest. The hospital at 2 in the morning was its own world, as distinct from its daytime self as a city was distinct from its own nighttime version. The rhythms were different. The sounds were different. The particular kind of attention required was different. Quieter in some ways, more concentrated, the noise stripped away to leave only what the night actually contained. She had worked nights for 9 years and had never stopped finding the transition into this version of the hospital clarifying. Something about the dark outside the windows. Something about the reduction. You saw what mattered more clearly at 2 in the morning than at 2 in the afternoon. She found Whitmore in room 11. He was 57, a retired school teacher from Tempe who had collapsed at his kitchen table the previous morning and had been brought in with a full cardiac arrest and had coded 3 times before they'd gotten him stable. He was connected to less equipment now than he had been at 3 in the morning. They'd pulled the intubation line 4 hours ago, and he was on supplemental oxygen and a cardiac monitor. And he looked like a man who had been through something enormous and was now on the other side of it and hadn't yet figured out what to do with that information. He was awake when she came in. The room was dim, just the equipment light and the thin glow from the corridor through the cracked door. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You talked to me." "Yes," she said. "About—" He frowned slightly. "I don't remember what. I remember a voice. I kept thinking I should answer, but I couldn't figure out how." "You were a little busy," she said. Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile, but was the shape of one. The expression of a man who had been on the outside edge of something and had come back from it, and was finding that coming back from it had a texture he hadn't expected. "My daughter's coming in the morning," he said. "Good." "She's flying from Seattle," she said. He stopped. His jaw moved. "She said she thought she was going to get a different call." He looked at his hands on the blanket. "I didn't know she's still... I thought we were..." He stopped again. Abigail let the stop be what it was. "Rest," she said. "Your daughter's coming and you should be awake for it." He looked at her. "What's your name?" "Abigail." He nodded slowly, committing it the way people committed things they knew they were going to want to remember. "Thank you, Abigail." "That's the job," she said, which was true and also not the whole truth, and she suspected he knew it, and she suspected that was fine. She left him and went to the nurse's station and picked up her charts for the shift. Pauline looked at her over a medication log. "You look terrible." 29 hours, Abigail said. "You slept." 5. Pauline's expression said what it said about that. Room 3 is a post-op appy, stable, but anxious. Room 7 is a 44-year-old with a GI bleed they're monitoring. Room 12 is a pediatric asthma, responsive to treatment. Parents are... She paused. The parents are a situation. "I'll start with 12, Abigail said. She was halfway to room 12 when her phone buzzed. Not a call. A news alert from the local channel's app that she kept on her phone for weather and occasionally used for nothing else. She had not set up news alerts. Someone on the software side had apparently decided she should have them anyway. The headline read, "Prominent developer Stuart Dahl detained by federal investigators in early morning operation." Below it, in the preview text, Maricopa County authorities confirm arrest in connection with ongoing investigation into... She turned her phone over in her hand and put it in her pocket and kept walking toward room 12. The parents in room 12 were, as Pauline had indicated, a situation. A father who had decided that the treatment the overnight resident had ordered was incorrect and had been arguing about it for 40 minutes with increasing volume, and a mother who was sitting beside the bed with her hand on her 6-year-old's back, the child's breathing now easy and regular with the treatment, the mother's face holding the specific exhausted relief of a parent on the other side of something frightening. Abigail looked at the chart in the doorway, then at the resident, who was young and tired and had the expression of someone who was right about the treatment and knew it and was running out of patience for being told otherwise. She came in and introduced herself to the father and listened to his objection for 90 seconds, which was enough to establish that his concern was about a medication. He'd read something alarming about online, and that the alarm had not been current for 6 years and was specific to a dosage 4 times what his son had received. She explained this. Not slowly, not with condescension, just accurately, with the direct efficiency of someone who understood that what scared people mostly needed was the right information delivered by someone who didn't seem afraid of their fear. The father sat down, The mother looked at Abigail and said very quietly, "He's okay?" "He's okay," Abigail said. "His numbers are good. His breathing is where we want it." The mother nodded and looked at her child and put her hand back on his back. Abigail left room 12 and moved to room 7, and then room 3. And the shift developed the way night shifts developed, not in a line, but in layers, one thing and then the next thing, the hospital doing what it did, the work requiring what it required. At 4:37, Drummond called. Abigail stepped into the corridor outside room 7 to take it. "Stuart Dahl is in federal custody," Drummond said. "We executed the detention order at 2:15 this morning. I saw the alert. His attorneys are already filing. It'll be loud." A pause. "I want you to be prepared for the possibility that the defense in the civil arena is going to look for ways to discredit the witnesses in the criminal trial. That includes you." Abigail considered this. "Let them look." "Ms. Hart," I said, "let them look." She wasn't combative about it. It was simply the most accurate thing she could say. "If there's something in my record that undermines what I testified to, they should find it. If there isn't, they'll find that instead." She looked down the corridor. "Is there anything else?" A brief pause on Drummond's end. Falco gave a complete statement. He named Broderick as the individual who physically took custody of the knife. "We have Broderick's car registered in the Dahl organization's fleet. We're looking for the knife." "You'll find it," she said. "We believe it's in a storage unit in Chandler registered to the LLC. We have a warrant. We're executing it this morning." She absorbed this. "Good," she said. And she meant it in the simple, complete way she meant the few things she said that simply. She ended the call and went back into room 7. The shift ran until 7:15 because the GI bleed in room 7 had a complication at 6:40 that required her to stay through the resolution, which she did, and which she didn't think about in terms of what it cost her, because that was not how she thought about it. She was in the staff locker room at 7:20, sitting on the bench in front of her locker with her jacket across her knees, when Cora called. She knew before she answered what kind of call it was. Cora's calls sounded different depending on what they contained, and this one had the quality she'd been waiting for. "We have a judge," Cora said. "The Honorable Patricia Wren." She was assigned through the randomized process monitored by Drummond's office. She reviewed the full record this morning. A pause. "She wants to see everyone in chambers at 10. "That's not standard." "No," Cora said. "It's not." Abigail looked at the jacket in her lap, the left shoulder patch, the worn elbows, the history of it, the accumulated weight of everything she'd been through wearing it, all the rooms and situations it had seen her through. "What does Ethan know?" she asked. "I called him before you. He's—" Cora stopped. "He cried a little on the phone. I pretended not to notice." "Good." "Abigail." Cora's voice had the quality of something she'd been holding and was deciding to say. "I have been doing this job for 5 years. I have had clients who were guilty and clients who were innocent and clients where I genuinely couldn't tell the difference. In 5 years, I have never had a case where someone worked the way you worked on this." She paused. "I just want you to know that." Abigail sat with this for a moment. "I'll be at the courthouse at 9:30, she said. She put on the jacket, stood up, and walked out of the locker room into the morning corridor of Mercy Crest General, where the day shift was coming on and the hospital was transitioning into its daytime self, louder and faster and more populated, and someone at the far end of the hall was laughing at something. An ordinary laugh, unremarkable, the kind that happened in hospitals all the time and always managed to be startling in context, evidence of something persisting. She walked toward it without thinking about walking toward it. Her phone buzzed one more time before she reached the exit, a text from a number she didn't recognize, different from the one that had texted yesterday, new number, same spare style. It said, "Knife recovered. Chandler unit. Still has Dahl's fingerprints." She stopped walking. She read it twice. Then she put her phone in her pocket and pushed through the exit door into the morning, which was already bright and already hot and already everything it was going to be, and walked to her car. The knife had been in a storage unit in Chandler for 8 months. Preston Dahl had claimed he'd never seen it, and Stuart Dahl's fingerprints were on the blade. Stuart Dahl's fingerprints on the blade changed the geometry of everything. Not because the case needed it. The case, by any reasonable measure, had been won in courtroom 7 the previous afternoon. But there was a difference between winning because the defense had built something strong enough to hold and winning because the truth had been so thoroughly buried that it left traces everywhere it had been moved, and those traces had been found, and they led directly to the man who had decided that an innocent veteran's life was an acceptable cost for his son's reputation. The knife was the difference between a verdict and a reckoning. Abigail drove to the courthouse with the windows down, because the morning heat was still at the level where it was more honest than oppressive, and she wanted the air. She'd been awake she stopped counting. It stopped mattering at a certain point. The body found its floor, and you operated from there, and her floor was higher than most people's, and that was simply what it was. She parked and walked to the courthouse, and went through the metal detector and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and found Cora already in the hallway outside Judge Patricia Wren's chambers, standing with Theo and a woman Abigail hadn't seen before. Late 40s, in a dark blazer, with the contained, purposeful energy of someone who operated at an institutional level. Abigail. Cora looked at her with the expression she'd had on the phone, something compressed and significant that she was managing carefully. This is Deputy District Attorney Lena Park. She's been assigned by the DA's office to handle the prosecution going forward. Park looked at Abigail with the direct, unhurried assessment of someone who had been briefed and was now updating her briefing in real time. Ms. Hart, I've read the trial record from yesterday. She paused. I've also read the AG's summary of the evidence gathered this morning. The knife, Abigail said. Among other things. Park had a folder under her arm, and she shifted it slightly. I want you to understand something. What happened yesterday, the incomplete discovery, the case assignment irregularity, that is not how my office operates. I recognize that distinction may not mean much to you right now, and I'm not asking you to accept it on faith, but I wanted to say it directly. Abigail looked at her for a moment. Park's face held the particular quality of a person who was genuinely uncomfortable and was not hiding it, and was not using the discomfort as performance. She said what she said because she believed it needed saying, and not because she expected anything in return for saying it. I appreciate that, Abigail said, and she meant it. Ethan arrived at 9:40 with the look of a man who had slept less than she had, and had spent whatever hours he'd had wrestling with the specific anxiety of someone who had been handed hope, and was afraid of what happened if he held it too tightly. He looked at the group assembled in the hallway, Cora, Abigail, Theo, Park, and now Holloway, who had materialized from wherever Holloway materialized from, with 4 stars and 3 hours of driving behind him. And something in his face did the small, involuntary thing it did when the reality of a situation outpaced his ability to manage his reaction to it. He looked at Abigail. Is it? Go talk to Cora, she said. She'll tell you what we know. He went to Cora, and Abigail watched Cora talk to him in the low, precise way she had of communicating things that mattered, and watched Ethan listen with his whole body, the way he listened to things that he was trying to absorb rather than just hear. Judge Patricia Wren's chambers smelled like old paper and coffee, and had the comfortable disorder of a room belonging to someone who read constantly and organized things by a system no one else could decipher. Wren herself was 58, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a chain that she wore up when she was talking and down when she was reviewing documents, and she moved through both states rapidly. She had reviewed the complete record since 6 in the morning. Abigail could tell this from the annotations visible on the file she had open in front of her, dense, marginal, the marks of someone who read actively rather than passively. I'm not going to pretend this is a routine chambers conference, Wren said, when they were all seated. She looked at Park. Ms. Park, your office's position. The state is moving to dismiss all charges against Ethan Brooks, Park said, with prejudice, effective immediately if the court will allow it. Wren looked at Cora. The defense has no objection, Cora said, with the understatement of someone who had very significant objection to the opposite. Wren looked at Ethan directly. Mr. Brooks, you understand what this means. Ethan looked at her. Yes, Your Honor. The charges are dismissed. Your record will reflect the dismissal. The circumstances leading to this dismissal, the evidence suppression, the witness conduct, the irregularities in case assignment, will be part of the public record of these proceedings. She held his gaze. You should never have been here. I want to say that plainly, for the record, because it's true, and because it matters that it's said. Ethan said nothing. His jaw was set, and he was looking at Wren with the focused attention of someone who was afraid that if they moved anything in themselves, the whole thing would become something they couldn't hold. You're free to go, Wren said, simply, without ceremony. Ethan put his hand over his face. No one said anything for a moment. Then Cora put her hand on his arm, and Theo passed a box of tissues across the table without being asked. And the room gave Ethan Brooks the space to be a person in it rather than a defendant. It lasted about 45 seconds. Then he straightened and took his hand away and looked at the table in front of him and said, "Thank you," to no one and everyone, and that was sufficient. The formal proceedings, such as they were, took 20 minutes. Documents were signed. The dismissal was entered into the record. Wren made a brief statement about the integrity of the judicial process and the obligations of all officers of the court, which was direct and pointed and notable for what it implied about the officers who had fallen short of those obligations. When it was over, they stood in the hallway again. Holloway shook Ethan's hand with the formal gravity of a man who understood the weight of handshakes and said something to him in a low voice that Abigail didn't catch and wasn't meant to. Park stopped beside Abigail on her way to the elevator. The DA will be making a public statement this afternoon about the investigation. Your name will come up. I wanted you to know before it happens. What will they say? The truth, Park said. That a witness identified and preserved evidence that the investigating agency had suppressed. That her testimony and her research contributed directly to exposing a coordinated effort to obstruct justice. She looked at Abigail steadily. They'll probably characterize it as remarkable. It wasn't remarkable, Abigail said. It was just paying attention. Park held her gaze for a moment. I know, she said. That's what makes it remarkable. She nodded once and walked toward the elevator. What happened to the people who had built this thing took the shape of the following weeks, months, and in some cases years. The specific grinding machinery of institutional consequences that moved without drama but with considerable momentum once it had been set in motion. Stuart Dahl was indicted on 14 counts, among them obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, bribery of a public official, and conspiracy to commit fraud on the court. His attorneys were expensive and vocal and ultimately limited by the fact that his fingerprints were on a knife that had been in a storage unit registered to his own organization for 8 months. Preston Dahl, his son, was charged separately with filing a false police report and with perjury for his trial testimony. Both men spent considerable time in civil courts as well, on a lawsuit filed by Ethan Brooks that Cora Vasquez took to trial herself 9 months later and won. Broderick pleaded guilty to obstruction and received 30 months. He cooperated fully with the federal investigation into the Dahl business empire, which widened considerably once investigators had a working roadmap for how Stuart Dahl handled obstacles. The cooperation bought him a reduction. It did not buy him the life he'd had before. Falco's cooperation, which had begun in the courthouse corridor with Abigail's flat account of what his choices had actually been, resulted in a plea agreement that reduced his exposure from felony evidence tampering to a misdemeanor filing violation with supervised release. He lost his badge, his pension, and the specific gravity that had organized his sense of himself for 21 years. He was 54 years old, and Abigail did not know what he did after that, and did not particularly try to find out. Reyes's cooperation was more complete and yielded a different outcome. He was charged, entered a plea, received probation and community service, and retained barely his pension after a departmental review that took 7 months and produced a report that was scathing about the command structure's failure to catch the irregularities earlier. He sent Cora a letter that she forwarded to Abigail without comment. Abigail read it once and did not respond to it, not out of cruelty, but because she had nothing to say that the proceedings hadn't already said more clearly. Janet Moss, the judicial assignment clerk, was terminated from county employment and faced criminal charges for her role in the case assignment manipulation. She received 2 years of probation and was ordered to pay restitution. The $11,000 she had taken turned out to be the least expensive part of what it cost her. Richard Calloway, who had done nothing corrupt technically, and who had recused himself appropriately when the information reached him, nonetheless retired from the bench 8 months later. His statement said it was a personal decision. People who knew him said he had never been quite the same in that courtroom after the afternoon when he'd understood that he had been positioned there, that his 22 years of authority had been treated as a variable to be managed by a man who moved courtrooms around like assets on a balance sheet. Some humiliations had lasting structural effects. This appeared to be one of them. Abigail did not think Calloway was a bad man. She thought he was a man who had spent so long being the most powerful person in the room that he'd stopped examining what that meant, and that this case had forced the examination on him whether he wanted it or not. She thought that was probably not a comfortable thing to live with. She also thought it was probably necessary. She didn't waste much time on any of it. The week after the dismissal, she was back on nights at Mercy Crest General. Room assignments, medication charts, the particular and unending human need of a floor full of people whose bodies had become the emergency. She was good at this work, in the way she was good at all the work she had ever done. Not perfectly, not without the specific friction of someone who cared more than was strictly professional, but in the way that actually mattered, which was that when she was in the room was better for it. Her colleagues at Mercy Crest knew something had happened. The DA's statement had mentioned her name, and the local news had briefly found her interesting, and for about 2 weeks there was a quality in the hallways when she walked through them. A slightly elevated attention, a few more direct looks than usual. The ambient readjustment of people encountering a person they thought they knew and discovering they'd been working with an incomplete picture. She didn't encourage it. She didn't discourage it either. She simply continued to do her job, which was what she would have done regardless. Pauline told her, 3 weeks in, "You should be getting paid more." "Everyone here should be getting paid more," Abigail said. "That's true, and also not an answer." "I know," Abigail said, and went to check on room 12, where there was a new pediatric case that needed her attention. Holloway came to see her one afternoon, not at the hospital, but at the diner where she ate eggs at the counter, which she realized only after the fact he had somehow known to find her. He sat on the stool beside her and ordered coffee, and they talked for 40 minutes about things that were partially related to what had happened and partially not. He told her about a position, a training role at a federal medical training facility in Virginia, curriculum development for combat medic programs, with a secondary function in advising on field trauma protocols for special operations units, the kind of work that would use everything she knew and build something with it that would outlast any single case or any single patient. She listened to all of it. She asked 2 questions, about the hours and about whether she'd have to move permanently or could structure a partial arrangement, and Holloway answered both with the careful accuracy of someone who had thought about what she was likely to ask. Then she was quiet for a moment, with her coffee. "I appreciate this," she said. "You know I do." "But," he said, "but my patients are here." She looked at the counter, at the handleless mug. "The man from room 11, Whitmore, his daughter came in from Seattle. He's doing cardiac rehab now, outpatient, 3 times a week. He sent me a card." She paused. It was a very bad card. One of those ones with a landscape on the front and a generic sentiment inside that he'd crossed out and written over. "He's not a good writer." Holloway said nothing. "But he sent it," she said, "because someone talked to him through the night when he didn't know if he was going to make it back, and he wanted that person to know that he made it back." She looked at Holloway. "I can't train someone else to be that person. I can only be that person." Holloway looked at his coffee, then at her. Something moved across his face that was not quite what she'd call emotion, in the conventional sense, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who had known many people in many difficult situations, and who had developed over decades the capacity to recognize when someone had found the exact right shape for themselves. "Virginia's loss," he said. "Virginia will find someone good," she said. He stayed for the rest of the coffee and then left, and she sat for a while longer at the counter,
not thinking about anything in particular, the way she did when she had the time. She thought about what Reyes had asked her in the corridor, whether it wore her out, doing the right thing in rooms full of people who had decided the right thing wasn't worth the cost. The honest answer was yes, it did. There was a specific kind of tired that came from operating in rooms where the default was expedience and the exception was honesty, and you were the exception. It wore on you in the particular way that friction wore on things. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily, in ways that required maintenance and attention. But she had also learned, across years of operating in those rooms, something she couldn't have told you as a young nurse or a young soldier or a young woman who thought the most important thing was competence. The exhaustion and the purpose were not separate things. The cost of caring enough was inseparable from the value of caring enough. You didn't get one without the other, and the people who tried to protect themselves from the cost also, invariably, lost access to the thing the cost was purchasing. She didn't know if that was wisdom. She knew it was true. Ethan called her on a Tuesday evening, 3 months after the dismissal. He'd gotten a job, logistics management, the kind of work he was built for, organized and procedural and requiring the kind of precise attention to process that most people found tedious and that he found clarifying. He had an apartment. He'd started volunteering again at the Veterans Support Center, not as a recipient of the program, but as a mentor, sitting with men who were where he had been and offering them the specific thing you could only offer from the other side of something. I don't know what to say to them half the time, he admitted. That's fine, she said. Mostly, they need someone to show up consistently. The words are secondary. Is that what you do? Show up consistently? She thought about it. I try. Some nights are better than others. The night you called me from the police station, he said. 8 months ago, I almost didn't call. I had the phone in my hand for I don't know how long. I kept thinking I shouldn't bother anyone. I know, she said. If I hadn't called. But you did, she said, simply. Because the other direction of that sentence led somewhere that had no useful end. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, Abigail, he said. Don't make it bigger than it was, she said. What was it? She considered. Someone paying attention, she said, at the right time. She ended the call and went to get ready for her shift. She put on her scrubs and her worn-in shoes and, over everything, the military jacket that had caused a judge to try to remove her from a courtroom and had caused a general to drive 3 hours and had, in its small way, been part of how the truth found its way to the surface. It lived in the back of her car, and she wore it when the morning was cool enough, and she did not think about what it represented so much as she simply wore it, because that was what you did with things that had been through enough to earn the right to keep going. She drove to Mercy Crest in the dark before dawn, the city quiet in the way it was quiet only at this hour. The lights and the empty streets and the specific silence of a place that had not yet decided what today was going to be. She clocked in. She picked up her charts. She walked down the hallway toward whatever the night needed from her. Some people spent their whole lives waiting to be recognized for what they were. Abigail Hart had spent hers making sure that what she was showed up, fully and without apology, in the work itself, in the rooms and the corridors and the moments where it mattered, regardless of who was watching, regardless of what they thought they saw when they looked at her. The recognition, when it came, had been real. She didn't dismiss it. She didn't pretend the courtroom hadn't mattered, or that Ethan's freedom was an abstraction, or that the people who had been held accountable weren't owed that accounting. But she also knew what she had known since the first deployment that had changed the shape of her understanding of what she was willing to do and why. The work that mattered was not the work you did when everyone was watching. It was the work you did at 2 a.m. in a room where someone was barely holding on, and you held on with them, and you didn't tell anyone about it, and you went back the next night and did it again. The truth didn't always survive. She knew that. But sometimes it did. And sometimes one person paying attention was the difference between those two outcomes, and that was enough. Not comfortable, not without cost, but enough to keep walking down the hallway toward whatever was waiting at the end of it.